In the freezing February of 1637, a man living in Amsterdam sat down at his kitchen table and realized he had lost everything. His home, his furniture, his savings, his entire future, not in a war, not in a shipwreck, not in a fire, but because of a flower, because of a tulip, because of a single tulip bulb sitting on the table in front of him. A bulb that was now worth almost nothing. A bulb that 3 weeks earlier had been worth more than his house. And what should freeze you in place is this. That man was not stupid. He was neither a gambler nor a fool. He was an ordinary person who had watched his neighbors grow wealthy, heard the stories, done the math, and concluded that getting in was smarter than staying out. Perhaps a weaver, perhaps a baker, and for a while he was even right, until suddenly, overnight, he wasn't. And this is the story of Tulip Mania, the world's first recorded financial bubble. And I want to tell it to you not as a cautionary tale about stupid people doing stupid things, because it isn't that, but as a very clear and very uncomfortable mirror held up to something deeply human that hasn't changed by a single point in 400 years. So stay with me, because when you finish this story, you'll recognize it from 1999, from 2008, from 2021, and if you're honest with yourself, you might recognize it from something happening right now. And to understand how we got here, we need to go back to the middle of the 16th century, when the Flemish diplomat Ogier de Bousbecque found the tulips growing in Turkish gardens so enchanting that he sent bulbs and seeds back to Vienna, marking the moment the tulip traveled from the Ottoman Empire to Western Europe. And when they arrived, the reaction was less like mild appreciation and more like shock, because Europeans had their roses, their lilies, their violets, beautiful flowers certainly, but familiar, soft, understood. And the tulip was something else entirely. A geometrically perfect color cup in vivid reds, purples, burning yellows, pure whites, blooming in early spring when nothing else dared open. And to 17th century eyes, it looked like something that shouldn't exist. And when the botanist Carolus Clusius planted some of the first tulip bulbs in the Leiden Botanical Garden in 1593, he discovered almost immediately that the Dutch soil flat, carefully drained, enriched by centuries of agriculture, was almost supernaturally suited to growing them, which meant the Dutch would become the center of global tulip trade, as they still are today. And this combination of perfect growing conditions and exploding demand would set the stage for everything that followed. But to understand how a flower became a financial instrument, you need to understand what the Dutch Republic was in the early 17th century, because without exaggeration, it was the most economically dynamic place on earth. Amsterdam had become the financial capital of the world. The Dutch East India Company (VOC) was the most valuable company in history, with a market capitalization that, adjusted to today's economy, would dwarf the combined value of Apple, Microsoft, and Google. Dutch merchants were trading spices in Indonesia, sugar in Brazil, silk in Japan, and bringing the profits back to this small, flat country of only a few million people. The result was an explosion of wealth, and when wealth arrives suddenly and in large quantities, it always looks for somewhere to go. So wealthy Dutch merchants began spending lavishly on visible symbols of refinement and good taste paintings. This period is incidentally the age of Rembrandt and Vermeer. Fine furniture, grand canal houses, and tulips, so that by the 1620s, owning a serious tulip bulb collection had become something like owning a Picasso in the 20th century, a declaration of wealth, taste, and cultural seriousness. And the most prized of all were a category called broken tulips, flowers whose petals displayed spectacular multicolored flames and feather patterns, designs that looked almost hand-painted, flowers with names like Semper Augustus, Viceroy, and Admiral of Admirals. And here is where history becomes genuinely ironic. Those magnificent broken patterns that made certain tulips worth fortunes were actually caused by a disease from a mosaic virus spread by aphids that, while making the petals look breathtaking, was slowly killing the bulb. The most valuable thing in the market was secretly sick. And now we come to the part where most people get it wrong. The financial mechanism that transformed an expensive hobby into a genuinely speculative bubble, and it hinges on a single technical fact. Tulip bulbs are physically present for only a few months of the year, blooming in spring, dug up in summer, replanted in autumn, which quite naturally created a futures contract market agreements to buy or sell bulbs at an agreed price for delivery in the next digging season. And now you didn't actually need money to buy a bulb. You just needed to sign a contract promising to pay later. You could buy a contract for 10 guilders, watch the price of the underlying bulb rise to 100, and sell your contract at a profit without ever touching a single flower. This was leverage. This was derivative instruments. This was a market detached from the physical reality it was supposed to represent. And if this sounds familiar, like mortgage-backed securities, or credit default swaps, or options on assets that don't yet exist, it's because it's exactly the same thing, 400 years ago, with flowers instead of spreadsheets. And by 1636, the tulip futures market had gone completely mainstream. It was no longer just wealthy collectors buying and selling. It was craftsmen, farmers, chimney sweeps, bakers and weavers, ordinary Dutch people who had heard the stories, watched neighbors turn modest investments into small fortunes, and quite rationally calculated that staying outside a market where everyone around them was profiting was the genuinely foolish choice. People were selling their furniture to raise capital, mortgaging their homes, converting everything liquid into cash, and the prices at the peak of the frenzy in early 1637 were figures genuinely difficult to hold in your head. At a time when a skilled craftsman earned around 300 guilders a year, a single Semper Augustus bulb sold for 6,000 guilders, meaning one bulb represented 20 years of wages, and another variety, the Viceroy, changed hands for a package of goods that a contemporary source meticulously listed: 4 fat oxen, 8 fat pigs, 12 fat sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, 4 tons of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a bed, a suit of clothes, and a silver drinking cup for one bulb, for something that would bloom for 2 weeks and then die. And at this point, rational valuation hadn't just been stretched. It had been completely abandoned, replaced by a single intoxicating belief: whoever I sell this bulb to will pay me more than I paid. Because they always have. Because prices always rise. Because this time is different. And then it ended. On an ordinary morning in February 1637, at a routine bulb auction in the city of Haarlem, where the auctioneer called for bids and no one raised their hand, that was all. No dramatic announcement, no regulatory intervention, no single catastrophic event, just silence where bids should have been, and the rumor spread instantly, and the psychological architecture of the bubble, which had always been nothing more than a shared belief, a collective conviction that the next buyer would always come, collapsed in real time. And within days, tulip contract prices fell 90% or more, leaving thousands of Dutch citizens holding obligations to fulfill contracts they could no longer afford. The courts eventually allowed the majority of peak period contracts to be cancelled for a small fee of 3 to 5% of face value. A pragmatic solution that prevented total social collapse, but it imposed enormous losses on sellers who had treated those contracts as real. Families who had mortgaged their homes lost them. People who had sold everything to enter the market lost everything again. And the tulips bloomed that spring, indifferent and beautiful, worth almost nothing. So, what do we actually learn from all this? Because what I don't want you to take away is the idea that Tulip Mania was about Dutch stupidity, or 17th century ignorance, or some malfunction we've since corrected, because we haven't. The South Sea Bubble happened in 1720, railway mania in the 1840s, Florida real estate in the 1920s, dot-com stocks in 1999, mortgage-backed securities in 2008, cryptocurrency in 2021. The asset changes every time. The dynamic never does. And the economist Hyman Minsky spent his career trying to explain why, and arrived at a deeply uncomfortable answer. Financial instability is not a bug in capitalist systems. It's a feature. Stability breeds risk-taking. Risk-taking breeds excess. Excess breeds collapse. Collapse breeds caution. Caution breeds stability again, and the cycle restarts. We now call these turning points Minsky moments, and we continue to experience them at regular intervals, despite central banks, financial regulators, behavioral economists, and 400 years of documented warnings. And John Maynard Keynes, himself a sophisticated investor who understood very well how bubbles work, put it plainly: markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent, because knowing a bubble exists doesn't tell you when it will end. And the person who correctly identified in 1635 that tulip prices were insane and bet against them was ruined when prices doubled again in 1636, before finally collapsing in 1637. Getting the direction right and getting the timing right are two entirely different skills, and you need both. And almost no one has both. What Tulip Mania actually teaches us, what it has been patiently trying to teach us for nearly 4 centuries, is that the forces driving speculative bubbles are not intellectual, but social and emotional. The fear of missing out while everyone around you gets rich. The social proof of watching ordinary people achieve extraordinary returns. The human need to believe that this time really is different, that the old rules no longer apply, that the skeptics simply don't understand the new paradigm. And these forces don't yield to knowledge because they don't come from ignorance. They come from being human. And the man who lost his home in Amsterdam in February 1637 was not stupid. He was responding quite rationally to everything in front of him. Right up until the moment, everything in front of him completely changed. Tulips continue to bloom every spring. In Holland, billions of them, in fields stretching to the horizon. Still in colors that are somehow surprising 400 years later. Individually, they're worth almost nothing. Collectively, they carry the value of everything. And with that reminder that the most dangerous words in finance are not complex, but 4 simple words heard before every bubble throughout all of history. Words you will hear again, sooner than you think. This time is different. If you don't want to miss the next video, you already know what to do.